Undercover black CEO finds Janitor crying, then the truth changed everything. He had wanted to see his store without the weight of his name. He had wanted to walk its aisles like a stranger and measure the truth of his company by the small things that never made quarterly reports. He had dressed down for comfort, not disguise, a simple cap, a plain shirt, worn jeans. No one stopped him or bowed. The anonymity was its own revelation. He felt ordinary in a way that made him listen hard at ordinary sounds. The bell over the door chimed the way it always had, a small sound that carried more history than the building deserved. He felt a quick lightness when the automatic doors closed behind him, as if he had stepped into a secret he had paid to keep unknowable. He moved without a plan, letting habit map his steps. He watched the flow of customers, the quiet choreography of carts and baskets, the cashier's practiced smile. It was all familiar and strange at the same time, like reading one's own handwriting and discovering new loops. She was there because the job required her to be there. The janitor's shift began before dawn and sometimes extended past midnight. She did not ask for notice or credit. She mopped, emptied bins, folded stock covers, and pushed the cart through aisle that smelled of citrus cleaner and coffee grounds. There was a rhythm to work that required no stories, until that morning when her chest refused to hold them in. He saw her at the end of an aisle, with an armful of cleaning cloths and a face he had not expected to read in a place that he thought he understood. She was wiping the floor in a small, steady way, but something in the steadiness faltered. Her hand trembled, and for a moment she paused as if listening to an invisible verdict. The mop bucket sat like a small stage beside her, unremarkable and full of water, and yet everything felt gathered there around her in the ordinary tools of her trade. He felt the moment unspool into attention. There was no spectacle, only the quiet collapse of someone who had been carrying a weight alone for too long. He moved because movement was the most honest thing he knew, and because he had come to learn things without announcing himself. He approached without manners he owned, without the protective armor of his title. His shoes met tile, his breath slowed, his focus narrowed to the lines of a face. Her eyes were red. Her jaw worked with the effort of keeping a voice small enough to not disturb anyone else's day. She glanced up and then away, a practice avoidance meant to keep conversations brief and transactions cleaner than confessions. The uniform clung to her not as a costume, but as a second skin that recorded years of the same motions. There was a small paper towel in her hand, used and crumpled, like a map of the morning sorrows. He had never known her name. He had never learned the names of most who worked in the margins of his empire. He realized how much of his life had been tallied in numbers and spreadsheets, while people's names had remained a mystery. For the first time in a long while, he wanted to know the story behind a face that had revealed itself in tears. He crouched by a shelf as though it were appropriate to crouch. He simply asked if she was all right. She blinked, startled, and for a beat she did not speak. There was suspicion in her silence, as if kindness might be a test she could not afford to fail. Then she let out a small breath and said that she would be fine. He believed the voice because people tell the smallest untruths to keep the larger world calm. He asked again, quieter, as if the question could carry a different gravity. This time she said her father had missed a payment, and that she had no one else to ask. The word payment landed with a dull, ricocheting force. He had thought he understood what a missed payment meant. A line on a ledger, a note to a collections department. Those abstractions felt shamefully easy in that moment compared to the fleshed-out human worry in her reply. She spoke of a hospital appointment, of a bill clipped to already thinner envelopes, and of a phone call that had sounded small and final. She described the hospital like a place where time moved with an expense no simple kindness could buy. He listened. He had written many checks in his life, some for causes he believed in, others for causes he could name only to justify the shape of his generosity. In a boardroom, he had the skill to shape sentences that made problems look temporary and investments look moral. In the aisle with the janitor, his words felt heavier, like weight stripped of corporate polish. He asked how much. She hesitated, then named a modest number that to him would have been negligible in a ledger, but to her and her family was a difference between staying and losing ground. He reached into his pocket by reflex and found his phone and a card. Then he remembered the rules he had set for himself when he resolved to be unseen. He was not there to hand out his name or to make a transaction with someone who might treat his gesture as an audition for gratitude. He wanted to see how truth behaved when his signature was not part of it. He asked where her father was and why she had not told anyone else. She said the father was at a clinic across town, a place that smelled of disinfectant and fear. She said that his cough had worsened and that the bills had multiplied with the same stubbornness as the illness. She said she had a younger sister and that both of them worked shifts and crammed more hours into nights than the calendar asked of them. She said their mother had left years ago, leaving small notes on the table in absence in her place. The story had no name for the man she cleaned for, no description of the executives or donors who made good press photographs. It was all local, immediate, and relentless. She explained that the company had a fund for emergencies, but that it required forms and approvals and a bureaucracy that moved with a slowness calibrated for someone with less than 15 minutes to breathe. She had applied, and the usual waiting had become threatening. He felt himself move into action without a speech. There had been times when decisions had been abstract and measured by metrics. This was not that. This required a recalibration of a man who had learned to weigh 1,000 small risks before making a move. He could have revealed himself, written a check, or redirected funds from a department line. Instead, he asked if she would allow him to accompany her to the clinic, as a stranger would. She agreed with a caution that seemed prudent and a gratitude that was wary. They walked out together, the automatic doors whispering closed behind them. Outside, the morning was patient and ordinary, as if the world had no idea that two lives were about to cross in a way that would ripple. He paid for a coffee with coins, savoring the small ritual of being inconspicuous. She kept a careful distance at first, the way people do when they are being taught to measure kindness. The silence between them was not awkward. It was a new language that had yet to be learned. At the clinic, the room smelled like antiseptic and paper. The receptionist moved with the professionalism of someone who had seen grief in many formats. They sat in chairs that folded around them like neutral witnesses. She explained the situation again to a nurse, and the nurse listened with a tempered compassion that belongs to the practiced care of others. The father's room had a window that did not look out on anything hopeful, only a parking lot she described with a dry patience. They found the father pale and quiet, watching a loop of news with a particular focus that meant his mind was seeking something else. He smiled weakly when she entered and reached for her hand with a hunger tempered by pain. The machines made a small sound that could have been a metronome counting the minutes of many people's patience. The bill lay on a table like a plain, terrible announcement, folded down to hide its length. It was, as she had said, the difference between staying in a strip of unknowns. The nurse looked at him, at the janitor, and then at the folded paper. She said plainly that sometimes hospitals had ways to bridge emergencies, but only when the right boxes had been checked. He understood the rhythm. Bureaucracy required proofs, signatures, and time. He also understood that some moments could not wait for the slow machine of policy. He reached for his wallet this time, but paused, reminding himself of the experiment. He wanted to see what would happen if compassion was an anonymous force rather than a public story. He asked to speak with a social worker assigned to the case. The social worker came with a folder and a patient understanding of stories that rarely ended in simple resolutions. They discussed options he had known were possible in a company but had never seen executed without fanfare. The social worker offered to file emergency assistance, to negotiate payment plans, and to contact an advocacy group that could move faster than the usual channels. There was a small, bureaucratic choreography that suddenly seemed capable of changing a life. She watched him, that same watchful look that had guarded her for years. The janitor had a way of folding worry into the shape of work so that people could go through their days unaware of the labor behind the cleanliness. She asked quietly why he would bother. He shrugged like a man who had taught himself to ask fewer questions and to listen more. He did not bring up his title or the company. He spoke like a passerby who would not judge the weight of another's decisions. The social worker talked of forms and approvals and of a gap that would not be covered because of a missed pre-authorization. When the social worker named a number, he stepped closer and whispered that it could be taken care of if the right account could be accessed. He was, by this time, convinced that the system could be bent to meet urgent need. The social worker arranged the paperwork with a speed that felt like a relief that had been owned. Afterwards, walking back to the car, the janitor spoke of small victories and of a life constructed with both stubborn pride and unavoidable compromises. She had wanted to provide for her family without begging for charity. She told stories of nights when she would eat later once the children were asleep, so that they would have food that day. She revealed details in small doses, not because they needed sympathy, but because she was unburdening the factual ledger of a life that had become frayed. He listened and learned the contours of poverty that had not found his eye in the world of investments and expansion. He noticed a list of periodic expenses that sounded ordinary but folded into crushing totals. School fees, medicine, unexpected transport to the clinic when the bus failed, a roof that leaked in rains that had become more frequent. For him, the arithmetic of survival had previously existed only as a line item. Hey, it was a breath, a rhythm, and the geometry of late nights. On the drive back, he resisted the urge to take out a check and leave it in a safe, anonymous place. He wanted to measure the truth of a system when one person appeared who would, without fame, give what was needed and then vanish. He thought of the ledger in his head and how it differed from the ledger of a human life, where numbers meant the difference between a simple night and a night of fear. He kept thinking about the way she had cried, not from spectacle but from the sheer weight of being responsible for others. Days passed, and he continued to visit the store in plain clothes. Sometimes he bought nothing. Sometimes he bought a bottle of water and lingered near the back, where clerks stacked boxes. He watched how people treated her, some with a glance, some with indifference, a few with the reflex kindness of those who saw a uniform and offered a word. He observed how shift changes left her tired, how she carried herself after a long day, and how she smiled at a child who pointed at a display. One afternoon he found an envelope folded into itself on a mop handle, as if someone had tucked a thought into the routine awake. Inside was a note from the janitor, brief and spare, thanking whoever had listened with compassion over the last week. The handwriting was careful, and the message said she had been able to arrange a payment plan that bought her time. It did not name him, and it did not need to. The gratitude was not for a person, but for an unseen kindness that had chosen to be useful. He felt a small, private satisfaction, but also a premonition that anonymity could be imperfect. If her life changed with the invisible help of a stranger, what then would happen when the truth of his wealth reached into the ordinary and reshaped how people moved? He fought the impulse to step forward and reveal himself, to take responsibility for the ways systems could fail and fix. He had promised himself to remain unseen long enough to learn. But curiosity had a way of collecting facts until they demanded explanation. He wanted to know more about her life because it was not only the present that worried him, it was the way history had shaped the present. He asked for the small details that fill a person's ledger, where she had grown up, what the neighborhood smelled of, who taught her to tie the mop string so it did not slip. She hesitated only for an instant before telling him that she grew up in a town where banks had closed and opportunities had thinned like the summer corn. The more she told him, the more the facade of his company felt like an island with invisible walls. He thought of the policies and procedures that had been created in conference rooms with catering and long lunches, then rubber-stamped by people whose lives did not require the same measures as those who cleaned their offices. He began to see how a million small decisions could add up to a gulf. He had the power to write different policies, to shift budgets, to reframe what was important. He began to plan, not for spectacle but for structure. He asked to meet with human resources quietly, under the guise of a concerned customer who had observed an employee in need. He described, without revealing himself, the failures he had seen in the emergency assistance process and asked what could be done if someone in authority truly wanted to fix the seams. He listened to explanations until he found the knots, the forms that could be simplified, the committee that met quarterly when emergencies had moved with daily urgency, the channels that required unnecessary stigma. Inside the company, the changes he proposed were small on paper and radical in consequence. He drafted a plan that would create a rapid response fund with fewer approvals and a faster timeline for emergencies. He suggested a liaison role between the store and social services to bridge the language between need and policy. He insisted on confidential channels that would protect employees from shame while giving them access to support. He wanted the kindness he had practiced as a stranger to be a structure, not a spectacle. There were predictable obstacles. Budget committees asked about precedent abuse, and legal teams counseled caution. Some executives worried about costs and precedent, believing that generosity should not disrupt profit. But he had learned a new kind of calculation that did not fit neatly into spreadsheet formulas. The moral arithmetic of a life saved was immeasurable. He persisted because what had begun as curiosity had become a commitment to design better responses. Word of the changes did not travel in press releases. They were whispered in human resources meetings and rolled out with careful training manuals that did not mention the reason they existed. The program began as a pilot in a handful of stores and clinics. It offered not only immediate funds for emergencies but proactive support, financial counseling, flexible schedules for family crises, and community partnerships for low-cost medical care. It treated employees not as line items but as people. Months later, the janitor's father recovered enough to leave the clinic with a cautious optimism that felt fragile but real. The family household found small new rhythms, a scheduled payment plan that did not require impossible choices, neighbors who visited with casseroles and small goods, and an employer who had quietly altered a policy in the background. The janitor resumed her work with a steadier step, though the lines under her eyes remained as traces of what she had carried. One evening, the CEO walked into the same store again, still in plain clothes, because he wanted to see if the change had the shape of durability. He watched the staff move with a different ease. They paused more often to exchange kind words, and there was an awareness that the company had begun to think of its people differently. He saw the janitor coming out from a cleaning closet with a cart and a paper cup of tea, and she smiled at him with an openness that did not require an explanation. He could have chosen that moment to reveal himself. He could have stepped forward and said he was the reason behind the checks, the policy changes, and the new program. He could have asked for gratitude and applause, narrated the story of the anonymous good deed until it became a monument to his sensitivity. Instead, he waited, honoring the agreement that had started his experiment in humility. He let the story live as a quiet correction to a world that often preferred spectacle. Yet secrets had their own gravity, and they attracted questions. A curious store manager had noticed the papers and approvals moving faster than usual, and asked higher-ups for an explanation. Small rumors began to curl like smoke in the air about an anonymous donor. Employees speculated and wondered and offered up names like prayers. The janitor herself listened to these murmurs with the calm of someone focused on practicalities. She had work to bind down and bills to sort. When an announcement arrived, it did not include a face. The company sent a brief note about improved employee support, citing the findings of a pilot program. It thanked staff for their resilience and invited them to use the new services. The message was formal and sober, and to the janitor it was a step towards something steadier. To others, the lack of a hero felt like an absence that some wanted to fill with speculation. Months folded into one another. The pilot expanded, then spread to more locations. A quiet symposium discussed best practices and the language of care. He would sometimes think of that first day, of the precise tilt of her hand as it wiped the spill. He would sometimes imagine pulling a curtain aside and watching the truth of a small life alter the course of policy. He kept those images like small talismans for the work he had chosen to do differently. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to the store manager, unsigned but curious. It revealed that someone had recognized a pattern of help, not by sight but by deduction. The note was careful and respectful, informing the manager that a local journalist had started asking questions about philanthropic patterns and that sometimes the right anonymity invites more scrutiny than the truth deserves. The letter suggested that the janitor's story had touches that made it compelling for an audience. The manager called a meeting and asked the team to be discreet. Rumors, once formed, have a way of becoming invasive. The janitor felt the pressure in the same way she felt the weight of extra baskets during rush hour, inconvenient, distracting, and a reason to bend time into smaller increments. She asked to continue working, to keep her life small and manageable. But the journalist made contact with one of her neighbors, and slowly the private became public. News spread with its own hunger. The reporter's piece framed the janitor as a symbol of resilience, of poverty, and of a system that could be nudged to do better. Readers wrote comments that ranged from fury at injustice to admiration for quiet courage. Social media gave the story a voice that echoed from office desktops to living rooms, and the company read the comments in conference rooms designed to manage reputational risk. The janitor found herself on the threshold of a different life, one shaped by invitations to speak, offers of small donation from strangers, and a kind of attention that wrapped around her like a cloak that was both warming and stifling. She had not sought it. She felt grateful and exposed in equal measure. She told him she did not want to be a public object of pity. She had wanted her father to be safe and her sister to sleep without counting coins. The rest, she said, belonged to a larger world. The CEO listened and understood. He had been prepared to stay in the background, to let policy do the work, and to avoid headlines. But he had not expected the consequences of a private act becoming public. He thought about the ethics of anonymity and the way it can protect both giver and receiver. He began to worry that public attention might remake her into something she did not want to be. He considered stepping forward to claim credit to shield her from unwanted attention. In the end, he chose another path. He asked for a private meeting with her and explained that the program had been expanded. He explained that many people were interested in her story and that exposure might bring both help and harm. He promised that the company would work with her to manage requests and offers in a way that would protect her privacy if she desired. He offered her an option, a meeting with an advocate who could handle requests on her behalf. She considered the offer with a practical eye. She wanted to keep her father's recovery the center of her life, not a platform. She wanted to protect her sister from strangers who might think charity was a way to earn visibility. She asked for time to decide, and he gave it. He felt that the real power in his position was not being the story's hero, but building structures where people could protect themselves when the world wanted to look. When she chose, she asked only that the focus remain on the program and not her. She agreed to a statement that thanked the company for support, but declined interviews. The company complied and issued a respectful notice, emphasizing the resources while protecting her family's privacy. The journalist moved on, covering other crises with the same quickness of a world that favored the new. The janitor returned to her shift with a guarded relief, glad that the light did not burn too long. He kept his distance from celebration. There were no parades. There was, instead, a quiet dinner at home with his family, where he spoke lightly of work and listened to their small stories. He had risked the kindness of anonymity to learn, and in the process he had discovered the power of institutional redesign. He had also learned the weight of choosing when to reveal and when to protect. In the months that followed, the program evolved further. It created a network of community clinics and partnered with nonprofits to reduce the cost of urgent care. It introduced training that taught managers to see the human behind the role, not as an incident but as a long-term relationship. It shifted hiring practices, offered financial literacy workshops, and created a confidential hotline for employees to seek help without stigma. None of it was glamorous. All of it mattered. The janitor kept working, steady and present. She continued to care for her family with the same determination, but with fewer nights of gnawing fear. The father's cough eased, and he found the small pleasures that make recovery feel humane. A laugh at a late-night joke, a cup of tea shared slowly, a neighbor's arm around the shoulder. Her sister stopped taking double shifts and found time to study in the quiet pockets that the company's policy now recognized. One afternoon, months after the first encounter, the CEO sat behind an unremarkable desk in his office and wrote a letter. He addressed it simply, to the janitor, without title, without flourish. He thanked her for the honesty that had opened his eyes and for the trust she had placed in an anonymous passerby. He enclosed an invitation, not to come forward, but to join a committee that would advise on how to make the program better for people like her. He asked if she would participate on her own terms. She accepted. The committee met with a frankness that had no public relations agenda. It was composed of staff members, social workers, and a few community advocates. They discussed the policies he had proposed and refined them together. They argued about the details of paperwork and the dignity of how help was offered. She spoke in a voice that was steady and careful, shaping policy with lived experience rather than theoretical models. The company changed incrementally, then more quickly as the committee's recommendations were put into practice. More employees found relief in moments when a crisis could have become catastrophe. Some lives took different arcs because the institution that had once felt remote had found ways to be present without performance. He watched these changes like a man who had learned to attend to small work. The details were everything. On a quiet evening, the janitor sent a short message he had typed with a careful hand. "Thank you," it said, "for being someone who listened without putting on a show." The message did not ask for more. It simply acknowledged a human exchange. He kept that message in a drawer and read it when he needed a reminder of why he had allowed himself to be ordinary for a while. He never made a spectacle of his choice. He did not ask for praise or recognition. Instead, he used his influence to create a framework where kindness could be standard. He thought often of the day he had found the janitor crying, and of how a single, human moment had changed how he understood responsibility. He knew that his decision to remain unseen had been both moral and practical, and that the real work was not in headlines but in the slow architecture of care. The story did not end with a single act. It continued in the lives that were softened by modest changes and in the conversations that happened when managers learned to listen. She continued to work with a dignity that had always been there. He continued to walk his stores in plain clothes sometimes, not to be dramatic but to remember what had started the change. In rare moments he would think about revealing himself and then decide that the greater gift was a system that did not rely on her being noticed. Small lessons hide in quiet choices. It is easy to walk past a neighbor who carries fear-like luggage. It is harder to notice, to slow down, to ask one simple question, and to accept the answer without performance. When small questions become policy, private relief becomes public architecture. A leader who listened could change how a workplace measured worth. A company that rewrote a form could save sleepless nights. None of this needed advertising. It needed steadiness. People willing to do the routine work of care, managers who understood that dignity was not costly but careful. If you carried influence, consider what one small change would mean in the life of someone you did not know. If you had less, consider the ways you could organize with others. The story finally asked us to be practical about compassion. Act quietly when possible, and act boldly when needed for others. Let me ask this simple question that shaped the beginning. If you had been there that day, if you had seen a janitor quietly in tears and had the means to act, what would you have done? Would you have stepped into the light and declared your help? Would you have sought anonymity and changed policy from behind the curtain? Or would you have organized others to alter the system so that no one else had to quiet their suffering alone? Consider your answer, and if this story touched you, subscribe to Beyond Yesterday. Join a channel where stories become prompt for change and where quiet acts can grow into something larger. Tell us what you would have done. Your voice might be the next small thing that helps reshape how we treat one another.